So I had some clients cancel this morning because the weather's really bad, and that afforded me a little bit of time. So I'm on Facebook, probably more than I normally am, and I'm reading some stuff. So Reason Magazine is a libertarian style, conservative online magazine, and they posted this thing on Facebook. And it says the historical reality, the Second Amendment protection of the right to keep and bear arms, is not that it protects the right to shoot deer, says Judge Andrew Napolitano. It protects the right to shoot tyrants, and it protects the right to shoot at them effectively, thus with the same instruments they would use on us. And it gives a link to an article called Guns and Freedom on the same subject. And when you go to that, they have in there... says, to assure that no government would infringe the natural rights of anyone here, the founders incorporated Jefferson's thesis, underlined the Declaration of the Constitution with respect to self-defense into the Second Amendment. As recently as 2 years ago, the Supreme Court recognized this when it held that the right to keep and bear arms in one's home is a pre-political individual right that only sovereign Americans can surrender, and that the government cannot take away from us, absent our individual waiver. So here's the thing. So when you actually look at the language of the Second Amendment, it says the right to keep and bear arms, right? Armaments. It's not really, it doesn't say rifles or guns because, but I guess that would also include things like cannons at the time. So Reason Magazine, setting aside their really terrible argument for natural rights, and man, it is a bad argument that they offer in here for natural rights. But the core of their argument here is that the Second Amendment protects the right to shoot tyrants, and it protects the right to shoot at them effectively, thus with the same instruments they would use upon us. So if we follow that logically, that means that whatever our would-be oppressors within the government, whatever that they're using right now, the Second Amendment protects our right to have the exact same arms. So now we have to think that it's not just tanks, but because you can technically buy a tank, although it's difficult, but the actual things that you would use to fire, the ammunition that you would use in that, whatever size, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head what the size ammunition that is, but whatever the ammunition that the shells that it has for a tank, you have to be able to buy that. You have to be able to buy drones. You have to be able to buy all sorts of things, up to and including nuclear weapons, right? Because those are, in fact, things that our would-be oppressors have within their grasp. They have access to nuclear weapons. And so the question is, do we want not only, handheld missiles to be something that everyone can have, but do we want people in the general public to be able to have access to things like nuclear weapons? Because we want to keep them out of the hands of entire governments. I mean, we have an entire program, right, that we have to make sure that, like, North Korea doesn't ever get nuclear weapons. An entire country. We don't want anyone there to have it. And so the idea that even a few individuals, because they're incredibly wealthy, could afford actually to have nuclear weapons seems really bizarre to me. It seems strange that we would think that that's a good idea. But if we follow the logic of the argument that Reason Magazine here uses, then that seems to be where we're led to. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I think this is common. I think this is actually something that a lot of people buy into. They talk about this, that it's not just merely that we want to have guns to be able to go out and shoot people, but the reason things like, and I don't want to get into a debate, but let's just say assault rifles, right? Because you know what I'm talking about, and I don't want to get into a debate whether or not you like the idea of calling them assault rifles. But things like assault rifles, the reason that we should have the right to keep them is not merely because we use them for hunting, but because, in fact, we need them to protect our persons and our family and our property from the sort of jackbooted thugs that could be coming through the door at any moment, that these people that are a part of the government could come and take, that the cops could come and they could go barreling into our homes and take our property. And that's why we have to have access to that. But of course, the issue here is those things don't actually do much good when you have these armored vehicles that roll around in the streets and could come through at any time and crush our homes. When you could have drone strikes that could just wipe out entire neighborhoods. And when you could, if you wanted, if they really wanted to, if you had some sort of large-scale insurrection, that the government could, in fact, send a nuclear warhead to take out massive areas. And so, since they have that in their power, since our would-be oppressors in the government have access to those arms, if we follow the logic of the argument that Reason Magazine, and a lot of people, and I'm using them just as an example here, I'm not trying to put everything on them. This is something that a lot of people that I hear them arguing all the time. This is the kind of thing I hear them saying. That's why I'm raising this issue. And I can quote them so nobody can wiggle out of it, and that's helpful. If we follow the logic of that argument, then the general populace should in fact have access to nuclear weapons. Now, whether or not, how common it is, I want to bracket that, right? Because I'm not making an argument that this is incredibly common. Let's say it's incredibly rare that previously law-abiding individuals do in fact use their legally obtained weapons to murder innocents. Right? Now, I'm not saying this is, I don't want to get into a debate about, well, it's mostly criminals who are doing this and blah, blah, blah. If it happens ever, and it does, I mean, it happens, then we have to be concerned that what about when those same people would have access to genuine weapons of mass destruction? What about when they have access to things like nuclear weapons? So let's say you have one very wealthy, very eccentric individual who has the money to buy that, and he has access to it, and it's perfectly legal because we think the Second Amendment guarantees him that right. And let's say that he has at some point decided, for whatever reason, it doesn't really matter because single individuals make mistakes, that he has decided that the government is acting against him, and so he sends a nuclear weapon to Washington, D.C. Even if we sent up some sort of anti-missile missile, right? Even if we were somehow able to block that, Washington, D.C. was, we've now got a full-scale war going on within the confines of the continental U.S. with nuclear weapons of people against people. That seems like a really terrible consequence. That seems like a really, really bad practical consequence of what people want to hold as a principled position. The principled position is that we should have access to nuclear weapons or any arms, whatever the arms are of our would-be oppressors, that the general population should have access to the same arms. This seems like it can't work because the consequences of that seem so untenable. They seem so problematic that it looks to me that we need to examine that core assumption that what we should do is that we should allow all citizens to have access to the exact same sorts of arms that our would-be oppressors have access. And like I said, I'm not trying to make some argument that we should ban guns because that's really a separate issue. What I'm saying is this particular kind of argument that the Second Amendment affords us access to all arms that our would-be oppressors have seems really problematic. And if in fact we want to say that's what the Founding Fathers intended, something needs to be changed. Because the Founding Fathers could not have imagined the sorts of arms that our government has access to at this point. They couldn't have imagined that we would be able to wipe out entire nations, that we would be able to send H-bombs, right? And save all the buildings while the entire populations die, that we would actually have the ability to commit genocide easily and effectively from a distance. They could not have imagined that. And because they could not have imagined that, it seems very unlikely that they had that in mind, that that was the spirit of the Second Amendment. And even if it were, even if it turns out that Thomas Jefferson and Madison and Franklin, people were all sitting around like, oh yeah, no, I can totally imagine a day where at the push of a button, we can wipe out entire populations, whole countries, huge areas, leave the buildings so we can go in there and actually now own the infrastructure. The infrastructure survives, but all the people are dead. Even had they had that in mind, I still want to say that seems like a problem. That seems like the kind of thing that we can question. They weren't gods. But I want to say also, so that there's that. But I don't think they had that in mind. I don't think anybody then had that in mind. I don't think they had it in mind because it's not the kind of thing they could have comprehended, they could have ever conceived in the first place. So that's what I want to say here. If that's the kind of arguments that you want to have, and you want to use that as your argument for defending anyone's right to have access to whatever kind of arm, I think you have a bad argument, or you have a problematic argument. I think you have a problematic argument because when you follow that all the way out to the end, you end up someplace that you don't want to be. And I'm not saying this to troll anyone. I'm not saying this to try to cause a problem. I mean it. I mean, I think you end up somewhere you don't want to be. That argument just can't work. I wanted to make a quick addendum to this video, something to add on to the end. Something that came up in a discussion that I was having with someone else. This is a natural right. This is not a legal right. That's the argument put forward by Reason.com. And the idea is that then it applies to all peoples, not by the government. It's not something the government grants. It's something that we have intrinsically as part of our nature. That means that it applies to all peoples, not just those here in the U.S. That means that since the U.S. government is a possible oppressor of the peoples of North Korea, that North Korea should be able to have the exact same armaments that the U.S. government has in order to protect themselves, from any possible attack from the United States. So whenever we're trying desperately to prevent North Korea or Iran or Afghanistan, whoever it is, whenever we're attempting to prevent someone else from having their own nuclear weapons program, we're then doing something wrong, because they absolutely have the natural right to have those weapons. And that's the issue here. That's what I want. On principle, if this is right, when you follow that to the end, then the natural right to have whatever weapons that your would-be oppressor has means that the peoples of North Korea, that anyone that's hanging out in Iran, that anyone in the world should have access, if they have enough money, should be free to buy nuclear weapons. Because the U.S. government has nuclear weapons, and they are a possible oppressor, they're a possible tyrant of those people. That's the consequence of this. That's where this goes. That's why I think, and that seems problematic, and I think lots of people are going to find that problematic, and that's why I think this argument has a huge problem.